Welcome back to chapter 12. This is video 4. Last video, we ended with this image where we were talking about the tympanic reflex. Remember that the tympanic reflex is the reflex that your body has in response to loud sounds, so that when you walk into a loud sound, excuse me, or you have loud sounds around you, it doesn't damage the ear, the inner workings of your ear. It helps to dampen those sounds. So what happens is the sound comes in through your ear. So the pinna would be here. It travels in through your external acoustic meatus. The external ear ends at the tympanic membrane. So those sound waves are being collected by the pinna. Uh, they are ushered or funneled into the external acoustic meatus, and they vibrate the tympanic membrane. All of this is considered external ear. The tympanic membrane continues to vibrate. It will vibrate the malleus, one of the first of the three auditory ossicles. The malleus then vibrates the incus, which is the second of the three auditory ossicles, and then the incus will continue to vibrate, send those vibrations to the stapes. The stapes is the auditory ossicle that is connected to the oval window. The oval window is part of the inner ear so that the sound is able to be transferred to the brain. That is the next step. Um, if the sound is too loud, both the tensor tympani muscle and the stapedius muscle will contract to pull these bones away from their various membranes to help dampen the sound when sounds are too loud for you. So now we're going into the eustachian tube. So the eustachian tube, also called the auditory tube, is what connects the middle ear to the throat. This is what helps to maintain equal air pressure on both sides of the tympanic membrane. It's usually closed by a flap that looks like a valve located in the throat. So I mentioned this at the end of the last video, but the reason why you are able to clear your ears, say when you are diving underwater or when you're flying, you're going up an elevator that is going very fast and very high, you'll start to notice that there's a pressure that builds up in your ear that starts to make the tympanic membrane more uncomfortable. Usually you can chew or yawn or swallow or blow your nose that helps to regulate that pressure. And that's because you have the connection from the middle ear to the throat. So let's talk about middle ear infections, otitis media. So let's talk about the word. Oto or ot, refers to the ear. Itis refers to inflammation. Media, middle, literally middle. So otitis media is the inflammation of the middle ear, caused usually by infection. This occurs because of mucous membranes of the auditory tube and middle ear being continuous. So remember, mucous membranes are the membranes, the epithelial tissues that line areas that are open to the external environment. So usually when we think about mucous membranes, we think about them in like the mouth and the nose. But remember, they're also associated with the ear as well because the ear is also exposed to the external environment. So because those mucous membranes of the auditory tube are continuous with the middle ear, you can have infection that travels. So the bacteria can travel from the throat or the nasal passages to the middle ear, causing an ear infection that started out as either an infection in your throat or your nose. There is a greater incidence of middle ear infection in young children because the auditory tube is, or the eustachian tube, is short. All right, so it's shorter in children, which means that if there is a bacterium in the throat or in the nose, that it doesn't have a very long distance to travel to get into the middle ear. Middle ear infections are treated with antibiotics. And in recurring cases, so children or people who tend to get middle ear infections quite a bit, they may be treated with a tympanostomy tube, which will allow drainage through a small opening in the tympanic membrane. So remember, the tympanic membrane is the membrane that lines the back of the external auditory meatus. So it is the end of the external ear. Tympano refers to the tympanic membrane. Ostomy, surgical incision. So os is a mouth or opening. Tomy means to cut into. So ostomy means to cut into or surgical incision into something to create a mouth or an opening. So a tympanostomy tube is a tube that has been put into the tympanic membrane through a surgical opening. And this tube will allow the drainage of whatever fluid is building up or pressure is building up on the other side of the tympanic membrane. We talked about the external and middle ear. Now we're going to talk about the internal ear. The inner ear is a complex system of labyrinths. A labyrinth is a maze, right? A maze, a puzzle, a maze. So you have the osseous labyrinth and the membranous labyrinth. So remember, osseous, the word means bony. These are bony canals in the temporal bone. This osseous labyrinth is filled with fluid called perilymph. Perilymph. Then you have the membranous labyrinth. This is a tube of a similar shape. It lies within the osseous labyrinth. It's filled with a fluid called endolymph. So you have the membranous labyrinth, the osseous labyrinth. The osseous labyrinth is in the bone, which is why it's osseous, in the temporal bone, and it has perilymph inside of it. And then inside of the osseous labyrinth, you have a membranous labyrinth filled with endolymph. So endo, inside. Remember, the membranous labyrinth is inside of the osseous labyrinth. So the endolymph is the one that's the inside. You have three portions of these labyrinth. You have the cochlea, the semicircular canals, and the vestibule. Cochlea, semicircular canals, and vestibule. So let's go back. So I forgot to mention. So the functions. The cochlea is the part of the organ that is responsible for hearing. This is why people who are deaf or hard of hearing because of damage to the cochlea will get a cochlear implant to help them hear. The semicircular canals function in dynamic equilibrium, and the vestibule function in static equilibrium. So you notice both of these have a function in equilibrium, balance. One is dynamic, one is static. When you hear the word dynamic, think movement, things that are moving with respect to one another. Static means stationary. So dynamic equilibrium is being able to keep your balance, keep your equilibrium while on the move, while doing some kind of movement. Static equilibrium is the ability to be able to maintain your balance while the body is staying stationary. Remember that for these tests, I'm only going, or these videos, I'm only going over the high yield information for this chapter. So we're only going to be discussing the things that are in red. So we know that the cochlea is the part of the organ in the inner ear that is responsible for hearing. Then you have the vestibule and the semicircular canals that are responsible for equilibrium. This organ has both parts to it, has both the hearing organ on one side and the balance equilibrium portion on the other side. And you have those vestibule and semicircular canal that are responsible for both dynamic and static equilibrium. So, getting a cochlear implant. Hearing aids are are designed to help amplify sound. So the word amplify, make sure you look it up. The word amplify means to make it bigger. So hearing aids can help a person can help a person hear if they just need the sound to be made bigger or louder for them. A cochlear implant directly stimulates the auditory nerve. So hearing aids are basically just like somebody speaking louder, but it doesn't really change anything other than the volume of the sound, whereas cochlear implants affect the nerve directly. This enables a person to hear certain sounds. The best time for a person to get a cochlear implant is before they turn 3, because the brain is rapidly processing speech and hearing. So if a person gets a cochlear implant by the time they are 3, while their brain is still processing speech and processing hearing, then they will more likely be able to hear normally, whereas a person who gets a cochlear implant later in life, after the age of 3, especially into adulthood, they may not be able to hear as well because the brain has already developed, or at least it developed in certain parts of the brain, depending on how old the person is. And because the brain has already developed without being able to hear, then that person's brain was not able to develop hearing those sounds. So, best time to get a cochlear implant before the age of 3. So this is what a cochlear implant looks like if you've never seen one. It looks sort of like a hearing aid on the ear portion, but then you have the cochlear portion that is basically attached to the person's skull, and there is a wire or some part of this device that is implanted in the head and attached to the nerve so that it can stimulate that nerve and allow the person to hear sounds. All right, auditory pathway. The sounds, I'm sorry, the path that the the sound information travels in order for us to hear and interpret the sound. So you have the cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve, the vestibular branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve. Yes, you need to know which cranial nerve is the vestibulocochlear nerve, so please look that up. That sends information to the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata sends the information to the midbrain, which sends it to the thalamus, which then sends it to the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe of the cerebrum, which is where you will be able to interpret those sounds. So, cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve to the medulla oblongata, to the midbrain, to the thalamus, to the auditory cortex located in the temporal lobe of the cerebrum. So, these are the steps in the generation of sensory impulses from the ear. So, you have the sound waves that are in the external environment. Someone speaks, music is playing, there's an explosion in the distance, whatever it is, those sound waves are traveling. They meet up with your pinna. The pinna funnels that sound through your external auditory meatus. Those sound waves then cause the tympanic membrane at the back of the external auditory meatus to reproduce those vibrations. As the tympanic membrane vibrates, it vibrates the auditory ossicles that will then amplify that sound. Those ossicles will then transfer those vibrations to the malleus, the incus, and then the stapes. The stapes is attached to the oval window of the inner ear. The oval window will then transmit those sounds to the fluid that sits on the other side of it. That fluid is called perilymph. The perilymph. Then those vibrations will pass through another membrane into the endolymph in the cochlear duct. So it goes from perilymph to endolymph. Different frequencies of vibrations in the endolymph move to specific regions. So your high notes, your low notes will be separated into different regions. The receptor cell is then receiving that information. That cell becomes depolarized. Remember, you should know what depolarization looks like because we've looked at it a few times. Now we're seeing that depolarization in a different instance. We first looked at it in the general functioning of a neuron. We looked at it again in certain senses. Now we're going to look at it in hearing. So the receptor cell, once that endolymph moves and starts separating that sound, the receptor cells will depolarize. The membrane then becomes more permeable to calcium ions. The presence of those calcium ions, I'm sorry, in the presence of the calcium ions, vesicles in the receptor cells then release their neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitter stimulates nearby neurons, sensory and impulses are then conducted along the cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve, and then the auditory cortex of the temporal lobe will interpret the sound. So all of this, or most of this, you've heard before. Just use this to help make it make more sense. And the couple steps that you hadn't gone over, just make sure that you understand those because they are very similar to what we've seen in the past. Hearing loss. About 8% of people have some degree of hearing loss. So in our room, say if we have 50 people, that'll be about 4 people in the room that have some degree of hearing loss. There are 2 types of hearing loss. You have conductive deafness and sensory neural deafness. Conductive and sensory neural. Conductive deafness. This is excuse me, interference with the conduction of sound waves to the inner ear. The sound waves are not being conducted to the inner ear, and so that causes conductive hearing loss. That is the case in most cases of hearing loss. 95% of those cases are due to conductive hearing loss. This is caused by things like accumulation of earwax, hardening or injury of the tympanic membrane, injury to the ossicles, or hardening of some aspect of the ear. So basically, what this means is that um, the sound waves can't get through. So if you have a bunch of earwax in your ear, you literally cannot, the sound wave cannot pass by that earwax. So um, it sounds like the sounds are dampened or lessened. If the tympanic membrane is hardened, then it can't vibrate. So the sound waves cannot be conducted to the ossicles to be transferred. If there's injury to the ossicles, even if the tympanic membrane is vibrating, the ossicles cannot vibrate. So then uh, those sound waves can't go to the next area. Sensory neural deafness occurs in the cochlea. So, conductive deafness occurred before you got to the actual organ, and you basically just could not get that sound to get from one place to another to be interpreted. Whereas with sensory neural deafness, the damage is occurring in the cochlea, um, or the vestibulocochlear nerve or the nerve pathway. So sensory neural, sensor, sensation, neural, neuron. So the deafness in this person is caused because of nerve damage to one of these parts, either the cochlea or the vestibulocochlear nerve, or somewhere along that nerve pathway, there's damage causing the deafness. This can be caused by long-term exposure to loud sounds, such as if a person works in a factory and the machines are constantly loud and buzzing, it can damage the nerve. If you go to concerts a lot, or if you listen to loud music in your earbuds often, or if you're around explosions or some other loud sounds very often, especially if you're not protecting your ear um, oh goodness, what do you call those things? The things you stuff in your ear to block the sounds, to muffle the sounds. So if those sounds aren't muffled, then those loud sounds being heard regularly can cause damage to the nerve itself. It's also caused by tumors in the central nervous system, brain damage resulting from stroke, and certain drugs. So in this case, it may not necessarily be the nerve that is directly connected with the cochlea. It might actually be in the brain where where that information is being um, interpreted. So, hearing loss is predominantly caused by conductive deafness, where the sound waves just literally cannot get from one place to another, or it can be a problem with the nervous tissue, whether it's the cochlea, the vestibulocochlear nerve, somewhere along the nerve pathway, or in the brain that is supposed to interpret those sounds. Remember, I said that the sense of equilibrium is tied to your sense of sound. So the feeling of equilibrium and balance is derived from two senses. Again, you have static equilibrium and dynamic equilibrium. Remember that static equilibrium is where the body is not moving. So this senses the position of the head when the body is not moving. Receptors are found in the vestibule of the inner ear. So if your body is not moving, but your head flexes forward or hyperextends back, even with your eyes closed, your body knows where your head is in space because of static equilibrium sense. Dynamic equilibrium sense senses rotation and movement of the head and body. Rotation and movement of the head and body. Receptors are found in semicircular canals. So vestibule for static equilibrium, semicircular canals for dynamic equilibrium. Static equilibrium, the organs or receptors are located in the vestibule, which is the chamber between the cochlea and the semicircular canals. You have the utricle and the saccule that are expanded chambers of membranous labyrinth in the vestibule. Each chamber contains a macula. Macula is an organ of static equilibrium. It has a patch of hair cells and supporting cells. The hair cells are embedded in a gelatinous material, so a gel-like material with otoliths. Oto refers to the ear, lith. The word lith means stone. So this is an ear stone or an ear rock, really, really small stone, like think grains of sand or grains of salt. Uh, these stones are made up of calcium carbonate. Gravity will pull on the gelatinous mass when the head changes position. So remember, gravity goes straight down toward the center of the earth. So if you change the position of your head, whether that's because your entire body's position is changed or, well, no, let's stick with that. Your entire body's position changed. So let's say you're in a roller coaster and the roller coaster is moving forward, your body is level with the ground, then all of a sudden it starts to move upward, and now your body, where your back is facing the ground. Um, you're changing the way gravity impacts your body. And so you're changing the way that gravity pulls on the gelatinous mass inside your head. And that, in essence, will change the position of the otoliths. And that is going to change the position of the cilia on the hair cells. As the cilia on the hair cells change, the hair on the hair cells will bend, and that will generate a nerve impulse. So before any of that happened, all of this was mechanical energy. So you had the little gravity pressing on the gelatinous mass inside the ear that is pushing on the otoliths, which is pushing on the hair cells, and it is causing it to bend. All of those are mechanical changes. Once the hair cell bends, once the hair cell bends, then that will generate a nerve impulse, and now you've moved from a mechanical change to now a electrical impulse being generated. So these are your semicircular canals. So you notice that each of these three are pointed in a different direction. And so depending on the direction that the head is facing, that will determine how the hair cells in each of these semicircular canals are affected. And that is how your body knows where your head is in space. Then you have the vestibule, which is very similar in that you have a the hair cells and the lymph in it, the fluid, the gelatinous fluid in it that is responsive to gravitational pull caused by the change of position of your head. So all of this is for balance, and this is the cochlea that is responsible for hearing. This is all one organ. So if you look here, sorry about that. If you look here, you'll see that you have these little, what looks like little rocks. These are the otoliths. You have your hair cells with the little cilia on it. It is surrounded by your gelatinous fluid. And so when the head is in an upright position, gravity is pushing down on everything. When the head changes position, gravity changes how it affects the otoliths, the hair cells, etc. You see here, as the head bends forward, the cilia on the hair cells also bend. And when the cilia on the hair cells bend, that causes that then changes that mechanical force, that gravitational force, into an electrical impulse. And so now those hair cells are sending electrical impulses to those neurons or through those neurons. Dynamic equilibrium. The receptors for dynamic equilibrium are found in the three semicircular canals. These three canals sit at right angles of each other. So if I go back to the image here, these are all at right angles of each other. So even though these two are in the same plane, one is facing one way and one is facing the other. And this is sitting in a different plane from that one. So three canals sit at right angles of each other. You have the ampulla. Each canal contains an ampulla. The ampulla is a swelling of the membranous labyrinth that communicates with the vestibule. So let's go back. Nope. All right, wait, ampulla, no, okay. Oh, here it is, okay. Ampulla of the semicircular ducts. So ampulla, ampulla, ampulla. So each of the semicircular canals has an ampulla. And again, ampulla is a swelling of the membranous labyrinth that communicates with the vestibule. And then you have the vestibular branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve. So before, when we talked about static equilibrium, where is it? Here? Sorry about that. Okay, so let's go back to where we were. So it is the cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve that is responsible for sound, and the vestibular branch is responsible for equilibrium. And we will continue with vision in the next video.